the heavy iron deed slammed onto the countertop, sending a small cloud of dust into the stagnant air of the general store. Harlan, the proprietor, stared at the paper, then at the man who had slapped it down, and finally threw his head back in a laugh that rattled the jars of pickled eggs on the shelf. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was sharp, jagged, and meant to draw a crowd. The other men leaning against the cracker barrels straightened up, sensing sport. Gideon stood motionless, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the counter. Beside him, his 10-year-old son, Thomas, shrank slightly, trying to disappear into the folds of his father's worn canvas coat. The deed was for a parcel of land up near the ridge, a stretch of vertical rock and scree that no cattle could graze and no plow could break. It was widely considered the most useless acreage in the territory, famous only for the gaping limestone moor that opened halfway up the slope. A hole, Harlan wheezed, wiping his eyes with a dirty rag. You sold your wagon team and your bottomland to buy a hole in the mountain, Gideon. What are you planning to farm up there? Bats? Echoes. The men chuckled, a low rumble of baritone amusement. Gideon didn't smile. He adjusted his hat, his face a map of sunlines and quiet grief that had settled there since his wife passed the winter before. He looked Harlan in the eye, his voice low and devoid of anger, which only made the silence in the room heavier. It has water, Gideon said simply. And it maintains 50 degrees, winter or summer. It's shelter, Harlan snorted, leaning over the counter. It's a grave, son. You take that boy up there, and the freeze will catch you before the wolves do. But hey, it's your money. Or, it was. Gideon took the receipt, gathered the meager supplies he had purchased, a sack of nails, a new saw blade, 50 pounds of salt, and a lantern, and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. They walked out into the biting October wind, the bell above the door jingling a cheerful counterpoint to the grim judgment they left behind. The trek up the mountain was a brutal test of the remaining mule's strength. The path dissolved into a deer trail miles before they reached the site, forcing Gideon to lead the animal by the bridle while Thomas pushed from behind. The wind grew sharper as they climbed, stripping the heat from their bodies, but Gideon did not stop. He couldn't. He had gambled everything on a theory that the town called madness. When they finally rounded the granite shoulder of the peak, the cave mouth appeared. It was a jagged tear in the earth, breathing out a faint, misty vapor where the warmer cave air met the freezing mountain chill. To Thomas, it looked like the mouth of a monster. To Gideon, that vapor was proof. It meant the earth was alive inside, holding heat while the world outside began to freeze. They unhitched the mule, the animal shivering in the dusk, and began to haul their crates toward the darkness. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the temperature plummeted instantly, but as they stepped across the threshold of the stone archway, the wind died. The air was still. And from deep within the dark, came the sound that Gideon had bet his life on, the rhythmic, rushing gurgle of running water. The first night inside the mountain was a lesson in sensory deprivation and amplification. Once the sun vanished outside, the darkness in the cave was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against the eyes. Gideon struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the high, vaulted ceiling of rock that dripped with condensation. He lit the kerosene lantern, and the shadows jumped back, revealing the rough, uneven floor and the stream that cut through the cavern like a black ribbon. Thomas sat on a bedroll near the wall, hugging his knees. The boy was trying to be brave, but the echoing drip-drip-drip of water falling from stalactites made him flinch. It wasn't the cozy silence of a wooden cabin, it was the cold, indifferent silence of geology. Gideon knew he had to establish order immediately, or the fear would take root in the boy's heart. He didn't speak of ghosts or monsters, he spoke of inventory. It was a grounding technique, a way to turn the terrifying unknown into a series of solvable math problems. Thomas, bring the ledger, Gideon said, his voice calm and echoing slightly off the limestone walls. He opened a sack of beans and poured a cupful into a tin pot. We have 40 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of beans, 10 pounds of cured pork. Count the nails in that box, and Thomas moved to the crate, his small fingers trembling as he began to sort the iron nails into piles of 10. Gideon moved to the stream. The water was icy, fed by deep aquifers that never saw the sun, but it was clear and moving fast. He dipped a bucket, tasting it. Mineral heavy, clean, and endless. This was their lifeline. He looked back at the boy. "The town thinks we're freezing," Gideon said, setting the bucket down near their small camp stove. "But feel the air." "Take off your gloves." Thomas hesitated, then pulled off his wool mittens. He looked surprised. It wasn't warm, exactly, but the biting sting of the mountain wind was gone. "The rock holds the summer's heat deep down," Gideon explained, striking flint to start a small fire in the stove he had positioned near a natural fissure in the ceiling. "We don't have to fight the blizzard here. We just have to fight the damp." Gideon walked the perimeter of their camp, a flat shelf of rock about 50 feet from the entrance. He paced out dimensions, his boots scraping on the grit. He wasn't just camping, he was planning a permanent structure inside the void. The cave offered walls and a roof that couldn't leak, but the sheer volume of air was too much to heat with a single stove. They needed a microclimate. They needed a house inside the house. "We build the sleeping quarters tomorrow," Gideon stated, checking the draft of the smoke as it spiraled up toward the crack in the roof. It vented perfectly, the natural chimney effect sucked the smoke up and out. "We have wood for the frame, but we'll use the stone for the heat." Thomas finished counting the nails. 312, Pa. Gideon nodded. Enough. He looked at the rushing water again. The sound was loud, but steady. It was the sound of energy, of movement. "Get some sleep, son. Tomorrow we stop being guests in this cave and start being residents." Gideon didn't sleep, though. He sat by the lantern, watching the stream, calculating the flow rate, thinking about the winter that was rushing toward them like a freight train. The construction phase began not with a hammer but with a sledgehammer. The flat shelf of rock Gideon had selected was mostly level, but to seat the floor joists for their cabin within a cave, he had to shatter the uneven protrusions of limestone. The sound of steel on stone was deafening, a ringing clang that bounced back and forth until their ears hummed. Thomas, ears stuffed with wool scraps, worked on dragging the timber they had hauled up the mountain into the cave. It was a surreal image, a boy pulling yellow pine lumber out of the blinding white daylight and into the eternal twilight of the cavern. Gideon worked with a manic intensity. He knew that psychological survival depended on creating a familiar space. A cave was a hole, a cabin with a door was a home. They didn't need a heavy roof, the mountain was their roof, but they needed thick walls to trap the heat of their stove and keep the pervasive dampness at bay. They framed the structure directly against the north wall of the cave, using the natural rock as the rear wall of the cabin. This saved lumber but required Gideon to scribe the wood to fit the undulating surface of the stone, a task of patience and precision. He used no carvings, no decorations, no wasted effort. Every cut was functional. "Why don't we just put a tent up?" Thomas asked on the third day, his hands raw from handling rough lumber. "A tent is temporary," Gideon grunted, driving a spike into the floor plate. "If you live in a temporary thing, you start thinking you can leave when it gets hard." "We aren't leaving." The boy watched him, absorbing the philosophy of the hammer. Gideon wasn't just building walls, he was building a psychological fortress for his son. As the stud walls went up, the space began to feel defined. It was a 12 by 12 box, tiny by any standard, but inside the vastness of the cave, it felt like a palace. The challenge wasn't the cold, it was the moisture. The cave breathed water. Everything they touched left a wet print. To combat this, Gideon built the floor of the cabin raised 6 inches off the stone, creating an air gap. He spent a full day stacking loose rocks to create a thermal mass behind the wood stove, a primitive radiator that would absorb the fire's heat and release it slowly through the night. When they finally hung the heavy wooden door, a door that opened not to the outside world, but to the dark cavern, the change was instant. They closed the door, lit the stove, and within an hour, the damp chill was replaced by dry, radiant heat. Thomas sat on his bunk, the smell of pine and wood smoke finally overpowering the smell of wet rock. For the first time in weeks, the boy's shoulders dropped. He looked at the small window Gideon had framed, which looked out only into the dark cave and the lantern-lit stream. "It's like a secret," Thomas whispered. Gideon nodded, running a hand over the rough-hewn table he had just set upright. "It is," he agreed. But we can't eat secrets. Now we have to make the water work for us. With the shelter secured, Gideon turned his attention to the stream. This was the gamble. This was the cave fish theory that Harlin had mocked. The stream flowed from a fissure deep in the mountain, ran across the cave floor for about 60 feet, and then disappeared down a sinkhole near the entrance. In the summer, the high mountain streams dried up or overheated. In the winter, they froze solid. But here, in the dark belly of the mountain, the water was a constant 50 degrees. It was a perpetual spring. But water alone wasn't enough, they needed a container. Gideon began the back-breaking work of excavation. He didn't want to just catch fish, he wanted to keep them. He selected a widening in the stream bed, a natural pool, and began to deepen it. They worked for days with pickaxe and shovel, piling the excavated wet gravel to form a berm. They were building a pond inside the cave. Thomas didn't understand at first. The fish will just swim away, he pointed out, watching the water rush over the new dam Gideon was constructing. Not if we build a gate, Gideon said. He used saplings, stripped of their bark and fire-hardened, to build a weir, a fence across the inlet and outlet of the pool. The gaps were wide enough to let the water flow freely but narrow enough to stop a fish the size of a man's hand. The mechanics were simple, ancient, and reliable. But a pond with no fish is just a wet hole. Gideon fashioned a dip net from the remainder of their wire mesh and a sturdy branch. We have to go back out, he told Thomas. To the lower creek. It was late November now. The world outside the cave was hostile, the wind screaming through the pines. They hiked down the mountain to the main river, which was already rimmed with ice. Gideon wasn't fishing for dinner, he was fishing for livestock. He waded into the freezing water, his legs numbing instantly, scanning the eddies for movement. It took hours. They caught 6 trout that day, keeping them alive in a water-filled bucket. The hike back up was agony, the water sloshing, freezing their hands, the bucket growing heavier with every step. When they finally stumbled back into the cave, the air felt tropical compared to the storm outside. Gideon gently tipped the bucket into the new pond. The trout, confused but alive, darted into the shadows of the rocks Gideon had placed at the bottom. 6, Thomas counted, disappointed. That's not even a meal. Gideon watched the fish settle into the current. We don't eat these, he said sternly. These are the start. We need more. We fill the tank before the snow closes the pass. If we get enough, they stay alive all winter. Fresh meat. No salt pork. No starving. By mid-December, the tank, as Thomas called it, held over 40 trout. Gideon had spent every waking hour hunting the lower streams, bringing up bucket after bucket until the snow became too deep to traverse the trail. The pond inside the cave was now a bustling ecosystem. Gideon had diverted a small side trickle of the stream to create a splash aerator, ensuring the oxygen levels remained high even with the density of fish. The sound of the splashing water masked the howling of the blizzards that now raged outside the cave mouth. They were entirely cut off. The town assumed they were dead. No one could survive up on the ridge in this weather in a hole, but inside, Gideon and Thomas were sitting in their shirt sleeves, the cabin heated by the efficient stove, eating the first cull of their herd. It was a small trout, pan-fried in the last of their bacon grease. To Thomas, it tasted like victory. It's sweet, he said, picking the meat from the bones. Better than the salted stuff. Gideon ate slowly, his mind already racing ahead to the next crisis. The fish were surviving. In fact, they were thriving in the constant temperature, metabolizing slowly but not hibernating. The plan had worked. They had a renewable source of protein that the weather couldn't kill. But as Gideon looked at the lamp flickering on the table, he saw the problem. The oil level was low. They had food, they had heat, and they had water. But they were running out of light. And they were running out of flour. The fish could keep them alive, but a diet of only fish would eventually sicken them. They needed trade. We have to go down, Gideon said, wiping his plate with a piece of stale bannock bread. Thomas looked up, fear in his eyes. In the storm. The storm broke this morning, Gideon said, standing up and moving to the window that looked out at the cave entrance. A slice of blinding white sunlight was piercing the gloom near the mouth. The snow has crusted over. We can walk on top of it if we make snowshoes. He turned back to the boy. We have to take the fish to town. Thomas frowned. But Harlan laughed at us. He said we'd die. Gideon's expression hardened. That's exactly why we go. We don't just need flour, Thomas. We need credit. And in this world, credit only comes to men who have something everyone else wants. Gideon looked at the pond, where the dark shapes of the trout held steady in the current. In a town buried under 5 feet of snow, where the deer had moved south and the cattle were freezing, fresh, living fish were more valuable than gold dust. We're going to feed Harlan, Gideon said, a grim sort of satisfaction in his voice. And he's going to pay us for the privilege. The descent into town was a calculated risk that felt more dangerous than the climb up. Gideon had fashioned snowshoes from bent ash branches and rawhide strips, wide teardrop shapes that distributed their weight over the crust of the deep drifts. Thomas moved awkwardly at first, stepping on his own frames, but the boy learned quickly that rhythm was the key to not sinking. They carried 2 modified pack frames, each loaded with a heavy, watertight keg Gideon had salvaged and resealed with pine pitch. Inside, sloshing against the wood, were 20 pounds of live trout in water that was rapidly cooling toward freezing. The wind on the ridge was merciless, stripping the moisture from their eyes, but as they dropped below the timberline, the air grew still and heavy with the scent of wood smoke from the valley below. The town looked dead. Chimneys smoked, but the streets were empty trenches dug out of 5 feet of snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their snowshoes and the dull thud of the kegs against their backs. When they kicked the snow from their boots and pushed into Harlan's general store, the atmosphere was one of grim stagnation. The stove in the center of the room was glowing red, surrounded by men whose faces were gray with winter fatigue and a diet of salted pork and dried beans. Harlan was behind the counter, looking thinner than he had in October, his usual bluster replaced by a sour boredom. He looked up as Gideon and Thomas entered, blinking as if seeing ghosts. The conversation died instantly. Gideon didn't speak. He walked to the counter, unslung the heavy keg, and set it down with a solid, wet thud. He pried the lid off. The water inside was dark, but as the light from the store lamps hit the surface, a large trout broke the water, gasping, its speckled flank flashing green and silver. The sound of the splash was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Men stood up. Chairs scraped. Harlan leaned over the counter, his eyes widening. Fresh, Gideon said, his voice rasping from disuse. Caught this morning. Alive, the word hung in the air. In the dead of winter, fresh meat was a fantasy, fresh fish was a miracle. Harlan reached out a hand, hovering over the keg as if testing for a trick. Where? He whispered, forgetting to be mocking. Does it matter? Gideon countered, sliding a piece of paper across the wood. It was a list. Flour, kerosene, wool blankets, dried fruit, and a new axe handle. Harlan read the list and laughed, a nervous, greedy sound. You want half my stock for a bucket of fish, Gideon? You're dreaming. Gideon calmly replaced the lid on the keg. Then I'll take them to the mining camp over the ridge. They have silver, and they're hungry. He turned to leave. It was a bluff. The mining camp was 20 miles away through impassable terrain, but Harlan couldn't know that. Panic flickered in the storekeeper's eyes. Wait, Harlan snapped. He looked at the hungry faces of the men around the stove. He saw the demand. We can trade. But the price is high, Gideon. You're gouging your neighbors. Gideon didn't blink. I'm feeding them. Fill the order, Harlan. The success of the first trade changed the dynamic of the cave, but it also introduced a new, vibrating tension. They now had supplies, sacks of flour, a new heavy blanket, and enough kerosene to keep the lantern burning for weeks, but they had lost their obscurity. The town knew they had something valuable, and hunger makes men curious and desperate. Gideon responded by fortifying their position. He knew that the single pond wouldn't be enough to sustain consistent trading. They needed a hatchery system. He spent the long, dark days of January expanding the operation. He used the new axe handle to break rock and widen a second, lower pool in the stream. This one was designated for the smaller fish that grow outs, separating them from the larger breeding stock to prevent cannibalism. It was delicate, freezing work. Gideon's hands were perpetually chapped, the skin cracked and stained with rock dust, but he worked with a possessed focus. Thomas, meanwhile, had taken over the feed duty. They couldn't spare their own food for the fish, so Gideon had devised a trap system near the cave mouth to catch the cave crickets and beetles that sought the warmth of the deep earth. It was a tedious job, crawling through the side tunnels with a jar, but Thomas did it with a serious pride. He was the keeper of the flock. One evening, while Thomas was scraping algae from the rocks to supplement the feed, he stopped and tilted his head. "Pa," he whispered. Gideon froze, his hand on the shovel. The sound was faint, barely audible over the rushing stream, but it was distinct, the crunch of snow outside the cave entrance. It wasn't the rhythmic pad of a wolf, it was the heavy, clumsy step of a man. Gideon motioned for Thomas to get behind the cabin. He picked up the splitting maul, his face hardening into a mask of stone. He stood in the shadows of the archway, waiting. A figure appeared in the twilight, silhouetted against the snow. It was a man from town, a drifter named Miller who usually did odd jobs for Harlin. Miller was shivering violently, wrapped in inadequate rags, peering into the gloom. He wasn't armed, at least not openly. He was scouting. He wanted to see the miracle hole when he stepped across the threshold. Gideon stepped out, the maul resting easily on his shoulder. Miller jumped back, slipping on the icy rock. "Lost?" Gideon asked, his voice echoing dangerously. Miller stammered, his eyes darting around, trying to see past Gideon to the warm glow of the cabin and the sound of the water. "Just looking for shelter, Gideon. Heard you had it good up here." Gideon didn't move. "There's no shelter here for you, Miller. Just a lot of hard work and deep holes. Go back down." Miller hesitated, weighing his desperation against the threat of the man standing before him. He saw the resolve in Gideon's posture, the stance of a man defending the only thing that kept his son alive. Miller nodded slowly, backing away. "Just looking," he muttered, before turning and fleeing back into the cold. Gideon watched him go, knowing this was only the first probe. The secret was leaking out. February brought a cruelty that the thermometer couldn't measure. A freak warm front pushed through the mountains, raising the temperature to 40 degrees for 2 days, followed immediately by a plunge back to 10 below zero. The thaw unleashed a torrent of meltwater from the peaks above. Inside the cave, the stream transformed from a steady, manageable flow into a roaring, brown beast. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder that vibrated the floorboards of the cabin. Gideon woke in the middle of the night to the sound of splashing, not the gentle lap of the pond, but the chaotic slosh of water breaching the banks. He grabbed the lantern and threw the door open. The sight stopped his heart. The lower pond had overflowed. The water was inches from the cabin's raised floor joists, swirling with silt and debris. "Thomas! Boots! Now!" Gideon roared over the noise. The issue wasn't the amount of water coming in, it was the water not getting out. The sinkhole at the back of the cave, the natural drain that kept them from drowning, was clogged. Debris washed down from the surface, branches, ice chunks, and mud had formed a plug. If they didn't clear it, the cave would fill up like a bathtub. The fish would be flushed out or suffocated by the silt, and the cabin would be destroyed. They waded into the freezing, thigh-deep water near the drain. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from their lungs. Gideon tied a rope around his waist and handed the end to Thomas, who stood on a higher ledge of rock, terrified but holding fast. "If I slip, you pull," Gideon shouted, then plunged his hands into the murky vortex. He worked blindly, his fingers numb, feeling for the obstruction. He found a tangle of pine boughs and rocks wedged tight into the fissure. He pulled, his muscles screaming, but the pressure of the water held it fast. He needed leverage. He scrambled back to the tool pile, grabbed a crowbar, and dove back in. The water was rising visibly now, lapping at the door threshold of the cabin. Gideon jammed the bar into the mess and heaved with everything he had left. He roared with the effort, a primal sound of defiance against the mountain. With a grinding lurch, the log jam shifted. The water pressure took over, blasting the debris down the hole with a violent sucking sound. The vortex swirled angrily, nearly dragging Gideon with it, but the rope went taut. Thomas was pulling, his small boots skidding on the stone, holding his father back from the abyss. The water level began to drop immediately, swirling down the drain with a greedy gurgle. Gideon collapsed on the wet rock, gasping, shaking uncontrollably from the cold, but watching the water recede from his home. The near disaster with the flood hardened Gideon's resolve. He spent the next week building a secondary overflow channel, carving a trench into the stone floor that would bypass the main drain if it ever clogged again. He was finished playing defense. But as the snow began to recede in late March, the real threat arrived. It wasn't nature this time, it was commerce. Harlin arrived at the cave mouth not with a request, but with a posse. He brought 2 men, large, quiet types hired from the mining district, and a piece of paper that looked official. They stopped at the edge of the fish ponds, staring at the elaborate system of weirs, dams, and the smokehouse Gideon had built. Harlin didn't laugh this time. He looked envious. "You're trespassing on water rights, Gideon," Harlin announced, his voice booming in the acoustic chamber. "I checked the survey. This stream feeds the town creek. You damming it up is illegal. You're stealing the town's water." It was a lie, a clumsy fabrication to extort the operation, but the men with him rested their hands on their pistol belts to underline the legitimacy of the claim. Thomas stood in the doorway of the cabin, clutching a fishing net, his eyes wide. Gideon walked slowly down from the upper pool. He held a shovel, using it as a walking stick. He looked at the men, then at Harlin. He didn't argue the law. He didn't beg. He simply pointed to the dam mechanism he had built, a single master keystone that, if removed, would collapse the entire pond structure. "It's not a dam, Harlin. It's a filter," Gideon said calmly. "And if you want to take it, go ahead. But the moment you step forward, I pull this brace. The water rushes out, the ponds collapse, and the fish go down the drain. You'll be left with a wet cave and a lot of mud." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into the shopkeeper's soul. "You want the fish? You buy them. You want the cave? You can have it when I'm dead, but I guarantee I'll bring the roof down with me." The silence stretched, thin and brittle. One of the hired men looked at the complex engineering, then at the frantic, wild-looking Gideon's eyes, and stepped back. "I ain't getting drowned in a hole for day wages," the man muttered. Harlin's bluster crumbled. He realized he wasn't dealing with a farmer anymore, he was dealing with a man who had become part of the rock. "Market price," Harlin grunted, retreating to a negotiation. "I pay market price." "No favors." Gideon lowered the shovel. "Market price. And you carry the kegs down yourself." Spring arrived in the mountains not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent burst of green pushing through the gray. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, and the valley floor turned into a lush carpet of wildflowers. The path to the cave was no longer a treacherous slide of ice but a worn dirt trail. And it was busy. The cave fish had become a local legend, and then a local staple. People didn't just buy the fish from Harlin's store anymore, they came up to the source. Gideon had established a trading post at the cave entrance. He didn't let them inside the living quarters that remained their sanctuary, but he set up a counter near the pools where folks could trade eggs, vegetables, and cloth for the fresh trout that swirled in the crystal-clear water. The validation was quiet, but absolute. One afternoon, Miller, the man who had tried to spy on them in the dead of winter, came up the trail. He wasn't sneaking this time. He was leading a mule loaded with seasoned oak firewood. He stopped at the counter, looking at his boots. "My boy," Miller said, his voice thick. "He was sick all winter. That fish. The soup we made. It stayed down when nothing else would. He's running around today." And Miller looked up, meeting Gideon's eyes. "I brought you wood. Good hard oak. For the smoker, it wasn't a transaction, it was an offering. A peace treaty." Gideon nodded, accepting the wood. "Thomas," he called out. "Weigh him out 3 big ones. And throw in some of the smoked fillets for the boy." That evening, the cave felt different. The door to the cabin was open, letting in the smell of pine resin and wet earth. The terrifying isolation of the winter was gone, replaced by a sense of permanence. Gideon sat on the porch he had built, watching Thomas by the pool. The boy was no longer the frightened child who shrank from the dark. He was stronger, his movements sure and practiced as he checked the weir gates. The stream rushed on, the heartbeat of their home, carrying the life they had built together. Gideon took out the deed, the paper Harlin had laughed at, and smoothed it on his knee. It was stained with oil and water, battered and worn. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. They hadn't just survived the hole in the mountain. They had filled it. The lantern light reflected off the water, dancing on the cavern walls like thousands of swimming fish, and for the first time in a long time, Gideon closed his eyes and just listened to the sound of the water, knowing that tomorrow, the work would continue.